author, linguist, teacher, and crucial
I met Noam
social
Chomsky.
critic, Professor Noam
needs
Chomsky.
a little introduction.
And he said,
To go through the ritual.
ever trust the state.
Our speaker tonight is Noam Chomsky. Perhaps you've heard of him.
We make a very serious error, in my opinion, when we tend to focus on one region of the world. So, if people are interested in Southeast Asia, they look at Southeast Asia. If they're interested in the Middle East, they look at the Middle East. That's overlooking the fact that the U.S. is a global power. And what it's doing in one place, it's usually doing in another place because they grow out of the same basic principles. And the case of the Middle East is not an exception. You want to understand what's going on, you have to look at it in a much more global framework, focusing attention on planning in Washington, which, since the Second World War, has dominated most of the world. The perpetrators, I assume, like everyone else, are probably Al-Qaeda or some group very much like them. And as for their motivations, I think we have a good understanding. They've been very clear about it for 20 years. Not these same individuals, but others like them. And their words correspond to their actions, so there's every reason to take them seriously. Nobody knows them better than the CIA because it helped organize and recruit them and arm them and train them, dealt with them for years. In fact, the same special forces that are chasing them around the caves in Afghanistan are the ones that trained them in the 1980s, so I'm sure they know all about them. And they've been very clear about what their intentions are. Bin Laden is the most eloquent spokesperson, and what he's been saying for years is we're going to drive the infidels out of the Muslim lands, and we're going to turn these lands into what we call pure Islamic states. So our main enemy is Saudi Arabia, because they're not a pure Islamic state, and the other corrupt and brutal states of the region. They were, of course, opposed to the Russians, who, as far as they're concerned, are indistinguishable from the Americans, just more infidels in Muslim lands. As for the Americans, they turned against the United States when, from their perspective, the United States was occupying Muslim lands by putting permanent military bases in Saudi Arabia, which is much more important to them than Afghanistan. And that's been a consistent position for a long time, 20 years. I mean, their first terrorist act was assassination of President Sadat back in 1981. Notice, not the same individuals, but the same sort of networks and groups. So that's what they've been saying, and that's what they've been doing. I have every reason to take it seriously. They tried to blow up the World Trade Center in 1993. That was a very ambitious plan. They were planning to blow up the World Trade Center, the UN, the FBI building, the tunnels into New York. That one, they were caught in time. If you can believe the U.S. police criminal system, the perpetrators are in jail. One of them is a Muslim cleric who was incidentally brought into the United States over the objections of the Immigration and Nationalization Service by the CIA, by CIA intervention, because he was a friend of theirs and they wanted him here. And when he was here, he organized terrorist cells which tried to blow up the World Trade Center. So those people, Sheikh Rahman is not the same as Bin Laden, but there's a kind of community of similarity. And there's a shared conception. So I assume that's the perpetrators. And I agree with the world's intelligence systems that those are their reasons, and doesn't seem much doubt about that. Then comes the second question. What about the reservoir of sympathy and sometimes support, at least acceptance of many of their alleged goals? So that's the whole region. Why is there hatred against us there? George Bush's famous question. Well, everyone knows the answer to this. A couple of days after I have to distinguish two things here. There's a category of people called intellectuals. Their task is to make up fabrications that protect power and divert attention from what's obvious and indoctrinate people and so on. And they've concocted all sorts of complicated stories about globalization and, failure to enter the modern world and this, that, and the other thing. Okay, and they envy us because we're so wonderful, et cetera, et cetera. All right, we can put all that aside. That's standard propaganda. Let's talk about what is plainly the case and is in fact discussed by serious people, like, say, the Wall Street Journal. So a few days after the September 11th, the Wall Street Journal, to its credit, began running serious stories in which they investigated opinions of people in the Islamic world who they're interested in, what they called moneyed Muslims, the ones with, the rich ones, the important ones. So bankers, international lawyers, directors of multinational corporations, people who are right inside the U.S. system, who certainly have no opposition to what's called globalization. In fact, they're part of it. Who certainly hate bin Laden because he's trying to kill them, but who nevertheless agree with much of what he says. And what they say is, their opinions are that the United States supports brutal and corrupt regimes which block democracy and modernization and development. They oppose particular policies like the decisive U.S. support for the 35-year military occupation of Palestinian territory, which has been harsh and brutal and relies crucially on U.S. military and diplomatic support. When you read in the newspapers that Israeli helicopters and jets are attacking Palestinians, that's total fabrication. U.S. jets and U.S. helicopters, which happen to be piloted by Israeli pilots, are attacking those concentrations. That's what ought to be said. Israel doesn't manufacture helicopters or F-16s, and they understand all that. They know that the U.S. has been blocking any diplomatic settlement for 30 years, since Sadat offered one in 1971. It's not reported here, and in the West it's not talked about much, but they know it. And they know what's going on there. They also know perfectly well that the U.S. and Britain are carrying out operations against Iraq, which are devastating the civilian society and strengthening Saddam Hussein. And they also remember, as Westerners like to forget, that the U.S. has and Britain and France and Holland and so on have no objection to Saddam Hussein's crimes. We know that for sure, because they supported Saddam Hussein right through the period of his worst crimes, gassing the Kurds, Anfal, chemical weapons. They continued to support him very happily. He remained a good, favored friend and ally of the West, which helped provide him with the means for developing weapons of mass destruction when he was really dangerous. So they listened when Tony Blair and Madeleine Albright condemned Saddam because, the ultimate monster even gassed his own people. They listened